Marshall County, Kansas, August 14th, 1942. The wind moved hot and dry across the fields, carrying dust that settled on everything like a fine coat of ash. Samuel Mallister stood behind his barn, hands wrapped around a length of rusted iron that had once been part of a water pump, pulling it free from the earth where it had been half buried for a decade. The metal groaned as it came loose, flaking orange rust onto his work gloves. Before we dive deeper into this story, if you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. It's incredible to think that we're all connected across continents, united by our fascination with the hidden stories of history. If you're enjoying this, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss another untold tale from the war that changed everything. Sam was 42 years old, too old for the draft, too worn by the land to pretend he wasn't. Around him lay a growing pile of scrap metal, pieces of machinery that neighbors had written off as worthless years ago. Broken plow blades, bent axles, sections of fence wire twisted into useless knots, the skeletal remains of a tractor engine that hadn't turned over since 1937. What Sam didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know as sweat dripped from his chin onto the Kansas dirt, was that the pile of junk behind his barn would become the armor plating on American tanks that would storm the beaches of Normandy, punch through the hedgerows of France, and roll across Europe toward Berlin. And in doing so, he would prove something the enemy had dangerously underestimated, that America's greatest weapon wasn't its soldiers or its generals, but the quiet resolve of ordinary people who refused to believe that anything, even rust, was ever truly worthless. December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The attack that dragged America into war also awakened something deeper, a realization that the fight wouldn't be won only on battlefields, but in factories, foundries, and farms. Within weeks, the War Production Board issued a staggering assessment. To maintain weapons manufacturing through 1942 alone, the United States needed more than 6 million tons of scrap metal. They were short by 2 million tons. The numbers were crushing, almost incomprehensible. A single M4 Sherman tank required over 18 tons of steel. Multiply that by the tens of thousands of tanks, trucks, ships, and planes the military demanded, and the deficit became a crisis. Steel mills were running at full capacity, but raw ore couldn't be extracted and processed fast enough to meet wartime demand. The solution wasn't going to come from the mines. It was going to come from America's attics, basements, barns, and backlots. The government launched the Salvage for Victory campaign in early 1942, and it spread across the nation like wildfire. Posters appeared in every town hall, schoolhouse, and grocery store, showing images of smiling children holding tin cans and housewives stacking pots with the caption, "Every pound counts." Radio jingles reminded families that their sacrifice at home directly translated to survival overseas. It wasn't just propaganda, it was the truth. What made the scrap drives different from other wartime programs was their radical inclusiveness. Everyone, no matter how small their contribution, could participate in the war effort. Children collected tin cans door to door, competing with neighboring blocks to see who could gather the most. Boy Scouts dismantled broken bicycles and hauled them to collection centers. Old men brought in rusted tools they hadn't touched in decades, and housewives emptied their kitchens of pots, pans, and even toothpaste tubes made of lead. In the rural Midwest, farmers became the backbone of the scrap effort. Their properties were treasure troves of heavy iron and steel, old plows, broken harrows, collapsed windmills, rusted water tanks, equipment that had been sitting unused for years. But convincing farmers to part with it wasn't always easy. Many were skeptical, wondering if this was just another government scheme, another way for city folks to take what little they had left. Sam Mallister wasn't skeptical. He had served briefly at the tail end of World War I, though he never saw combat before the armistice was signed. He knew what war cost, had seen young men return with hollow eyes and missing limbs, and he understood that this war would be worse. He also understood something simpler. He couldn't carry a rifle anymore, but he could still carry his weight. So he walked his land with a notebook, cataloging every piece of metal he could find. He dragged broken plowshares from the shed, dismantled a collapsed windmill piece by piece until the blades and frame lay stacked like giant bones, and pulled fence posts from the ground that had been there since his father's time. His teenage son, David, helped him load the pieces onto a borrowed flatbed trailer, and his wife, Martha, watched from the porch with a mixture of pride and concern. Some neighbors thought he'd lost his mind. "Sam's gone scrap mad," they joked at the diner. "He's going to donate the hen house next." But Sam didn't hear them, or if he did, he didn't care. Because in that pile of rust and broken iron, he saw something no one else could. A future where every bolt and hinge might save a life, where a man too old for combat could still fight in his own way. By the end of August, Sam had collected over 10 tons of metal. It sat behind his barn, tarped and tied down, waiting for transport. It was the largest single contribution from any farm in Marshall County, and when the county organizer came to inspect it, he stood there shaking his head in disbelief. "That's a hell of a pile, Sam," he said. Sam just nodded. "It's a hell of a war." The metal was loaded onto rail cars operated by the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway and sent east toward Detroit. In 1942, Detroit had transformed from the Motor City into the arsenal of democracy. Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors had converted their assembly lines from civilian cars to military vehicles, producing tanks, jeeps, and trucks at a pace the world had never seen. Among the most important facilities was the Detroit Tank Arsenal in Warren, Michigan, operated by Chrysler and built specifically to mass-produce the M4 Sherman tank. The arsenal was a marvel of industrial engineering. At its peak, it rolled out one completed tank every hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. By the war's end, it would produce over 22,000 Sherman tanks. But none of that was possible without raw materials. And raw materials were exactly what farms like Sam's provided. When the scrap metal arrived in Detroit, it was unloaded, sorted by type, and fed into massive electric arc furnaces that burned hotter than the surface of the sun. The metal was melted, purified, and poured into ingots, blocks of standardized steel that could be pressed, rolled, and shaped into armor plates, chassis components, and internal frames. Even low-grade farm scrap, when properly refined, could meet the tensile strength needed for armored vehicles. Sam's windmill blades, his father's iron bed frame, the rusted water pump, they all disappeared into the furnace, reborn as something stronger. There were no serial numbers linking specific scrap donations to specific tanks, no plaques or commemorative labels. But metallurgists confirmed that by 1943, up to 40% of the steel in American tanks came from recycled civilian sources. Sam's contribution had crossed state lines, passed through fire, and been forged into the backbone of an army. June 6, 1944, Omaha Beach, Normandy. Second Lieutenant Robert Hastings crouched inside the commander's hatch of his M4 Sherman, a tank he'd nicknamed Liberty Rose, as it rolled down the ramp of a landing craft and into the surf. The water was chest deep, the noise deafening, the air thick with smoke and screaming metal. German machine guns raked the beach from fortified positions on the bluffs above, and artillery shells exploded in geysers of sand and seawater. Hastings was 23 years old, from Des Moines, Iowa, where he'd driven grain trucks for his father's feed business before the war. The Army had made him a tanker because he was good with machines, calm under pressure, and didn't panic when things broke down. Right now, everything around him was breaking down, but Liberty Rose kept moving, its engine roaring, its treads clawing through sand and surf. What Hastings didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that the front armor plate of his tank had once been part of a windmill in Kansas, that the steel frame supporting his crew compartment had been salvaged from a cattle trough, that the metal keeping him alive had been donated by a farmer who'd never fired a shot in combat. 4 days later, near the village of Isigny-sur-Mer, Hastings's tank unit was ambushed while navigating a narrow hedge-lined road. A German Panzer IV fired from concealed cover less than 500 yards away, and the shell slammed into Liberty Rose's front armor with a sound like the end of the world. The tank skidded sideways into a ditch, flames sparking beneath the hull, smoke pouring from the engine compartment. Inside, Hastings was thrown against the hatch, tasted blood, and fumbled for the release. His ears rang, his vision blurred, but he could still think clearly enough to know they had seconds, maybe less, before the tank became an inferno. He yanked the hatch open and shouted for his crew to bail out, and one by one they tumbled into the brush as small arms fire cracked overhead. When they regrouped 30 minutes later, rescued by advancing infantry, Hastings turned back to look at Liberty Rose. The tank was smoldering, but it hadn't exploded. The front armor plate was deformed, cracked, but it had held just long enough for them to escape. In his field journal that night, Hastings wrote, "Something saved us. That front plate should have buckled. I don't know what kind of steel we were riding in, but it was damn good steel." It was Sam's steel. It was the steel of 1,000 farms, 1,000,000 kitchens, 10 million households that had given what they could spare, and then given more. It was the steel of a nation that understood, on some fundamental level, that war wasn't won by soldiers alone but by the collective will of a people who refused to stand by while others fought. Back in Kansas, Sam never heard about Liberty Rose or Robert Hastings. He was harvesting corn that fall, the same way he'd done for 20 years, slow and steady, with David driving the combine and Martha waving from the porch. The scrap pile behind his barn was long gone, melted and reforged and scattered across Europe in tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces. But Sam didn't need confirmation. He'd done what he could, and that was enough. In Berlin, Nazi propagandists had mocked the American scrap drives as desperate and childish. In radio broadcasts from 1942, German commentators scoffed. "The Americans believe they can defeat the Reich with curtain rods and broken bed frames. Let them try." And try they did. Because what the Third Reich failed to understand, what every tyrant fails to understand, is that the strength of democracy isn't in its parades or its propaganda, it's in its people. By the end of 1942, the United States had collected over 24 million tons of scrap metal. That included more than 5 million tons of iron and steel, 800,000 tons of copper, and 50,000 tons of aluminum, much of it stripped from homes, barns, and garages. And unlike in totalitarian states where workers labored under threat, Americans contributed voluntarily, driven not by fear but by belief that every pot and pipe and broken tool could become something greater. That belief had power. In Nazi Germany, production was centrally controlled, inflexible, and increasingly choked by Allied bombing raids. Oil refineries, railroads, and factories were hammered into rubble by round-the-clock airstrikes. Meanwhile, American industry thrived, fed not only by steel mills and government contracts but by the never-ending flood of raw material sent in by citizens like Sam. Sherman tanks, once dismissed as inferior by German tank crews, began showing up in overwhelming numbers. What they lacked in individual armor, they made up for in speed, quantity, and logistics. They kept coming, and behind everyone was a chain of effort that stretched from battlefield to blast furnace to backyard. The irony was brutal. What Nazi propaganda had labeled worthless junk was now tearing through their lines. The war ended in September 1945 with Japan's surrender aboard the USS Missouri. Soldiers came home, towns tried to remember what peace felt like, and in Kansas, Sam Mallister went back to his fields. The scrap pile was gone, but in its place was something intangible, something far more permanent: pride. He never spoke much about what he'd done during the war. He wasn't the kind of man who chased attention, but those close to him noticed the quiet reverence with which he treated the small framed certificate now hanging in the parlor, issued by the War Production Board in early 1946, recognizing his extraordinary contribution to America's war effort. It meant more to him than any medal. In the years that followed, David enrolled at Kansas State University studying mechanical engineering. His senior project was designing a post-war farm tractor that could be built from surplus military parts. He didn't just inherit his father's land, he inherited his father's purpose. Later, David moved to Michigan and took a job at General Dynamics Land Systems, a defense contractor that built the successors to the Sherman, the M60 Patton, and the M1 Abrams. Sam lived long enough to see David's first design enter production. He passed away in 1971 at the age of 71, seated in his rocking chair on the front porch, his hat tilted low over his eyes, and his boots still dusty from morning chores. His obituary was short, making no mention of war heroics or tanks. It said only, Samuel J. Mallister, farmer, husband, father, believed in hard work, good land, and helping when it mattered most. But in the years that followed, the story of his scrap pile began to spread. First among local veterans, then through the County Historical Society. A teacher at Marshall County High School turned it into a lesson on World War II. Sam became a symbol of the homefront hero, a man who never fired a shot yet helped win a war. In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of D-Day, Robert Hastings was interviewed on national television. He spoke about the ambush near Isigny-sur-Mer, about the shell that hit but did not kill. And then, unprompted, he said, "I don't know who gave the steel for that tank, but if you're out there, if you're watching, I owe you my life." In Marshall County, Kansas, David Mallister watched that broadcast with his children. He didn't cry, but he did pause the TV, rewind it, and play that quote again. "Your great-grandfather," he said quietly, "might have been that man." His daughter, 12 years old, looked confused. "Great-grandpa was in the war?" David smiled. "Not exactly, but he helped." The story of Sam Mallister isn't about glory or recognition. It's about the quiet conviction it takes to do the right thing when no one's watching, to lift what others leave behind, to turn rust into resilience. It's about understanding that in a total war, there are no small contributions, only small thinking. When historians talk about why the Allies won World War II, they point to industrial capacity, strategic leadership, technological innovation. But underneath all of that was something simpler and more profound. The collective will of millions of ordinary people who believed that even their smallest act mattered. Sam Mallister was one of those people. He hauled scrap metal because he couldn't haul a rifle. He gave away his childhood bed frame because someone else needed it more. And somewhere on a muddy road in France, a tank commander walked away from an ambush alive because a farmer in Kansas refused to throw anything away. That's the most American thing of all.